Hi, everybody. This is Sue Pricco welcoming you to Contra Costa Taxpayers Association Lunchtime Speaker Series. We are privileged today to have with us noted journalist whose career has spanned 61 years plus. And I was told just now that he started it when he was just 16, which is pretty amazing. And he is with CalMatters, and he'll tell you a little bit about CalMatters. We have followed his career and a number of his columns for many years at Coco Tax, and we are privileged now to present to you Mr. Dan Walters.
Thank you very much, and nice to be speaking to you albeit by Zoom. It's not exactly Zoom school, but it's Zoom nevertheless. Let me tell you a little bit about CalMatters.org, which I joined. Heaven's sakes, it's been almost 4 years now. 4 years ago, I left the Sacramento Bee after 33 years and went to CalMatters and took the column that I'd been writing for the Bee and before that for the Sacramento Union, starting in 1981, and moved over to CalMatters.org, which is a nonprofit news organization that has grown by incredible lengths over the last several years. When I went to work with CalMatters in 2017, they were I think about a year old, maybe a year and a half old. They had maybe 7 employees, something like that. And today we have almost 50 people working all around the state, not all of them in Sacramento, but nevertheless, it's by far, by quantum leaps far, bigger than any other news organization covering politics and public policy in California. It is, as I said, nonprofit. It was founded by a couple of women from Silicon Valley, one Republican and one Democrat, who thought that California needed more in-depth journalism about what was going on in California. And it just keeps growing. It's like, I don't even know, probably 3/4 of the people who work there now. They've all been hired since we went into COVID, it seems to be. But at any rate, it's an interesting thing. It's all free. Doesn't cost you anything. CalMatters.org. You can sign up you can look at the website. You can sign up for newsletters. You can get my column. I write 4 columns a week. You can get all those once a week if you want them. They come out on Fridays. You can sign up for our daily newsletter that goes into what's going on now in California. You can do all that stuff, all free. Doesn't cost anything. It's good stuff. I hope you check it out. Anyway, so what's going on in Sacramento these days? Well, there are 2 things going on in Sacramento these days. There are a lot of things going on, but 2 big things. One is obviously the recall campaign directed at Governor Gavin Newsom that has qualified for the ballot. Not officially yet. They still have to go through a couple of little hoops, but basically it's qualified. And we're likely to have an election in November because of the way the calendar works and the deadlines and the various periods that you have to follow. Probably it'll be in about the middle of November when we'll have this election on whether Gavin Newsom should be recalled. It'll be a 2-part election. One part will be, do you want to recall Gavin Newsom? The second part is, well, if he is recalled, which of these candidates do you want to replace him? You might recall we went through this 18 years ago with Gray Davis. And at that time, there were 135 candidates on the ballot to replace Gray Davis. Arnold Schwarzenegger won the second half of the election because the voters did vote to recall Gray Davis. And he got about 46% of the votes to replace him. And that's how he wound up as governor. We don't know who's all going to be on the ballot as potential successors. So far, it's mostly Republicans that said they would run, which might hurt the Republican chances since they would probably serve their own interests better if they just focused on one candidate rather than having a bunch of candidates. Whether there's going to be a Democrat or at least a fairly well-known Democrat on the ballot, don't know yet. Possibly yes, possibly no. It's an interesting exercise. And if you had to if you had to bet on the outcome right now, based on the polling and the circumstances of the thing, he probably will beat the recall, probably. But that's, 6 months from now. And you cannot predict what the circumstances will be in California at the time when people actually receive ballots in their mailboxes to be returned. The economy could go south again. The pandemic could flare up again. There could be other things happen. We might have a summer of wildfires, of blackouts. All of these things could affect the mood of the voters in November. So you cannot say that what the mood is today necessarily means that will be the mood in November. Like again, chances are he'll beat the recall, but there are no guarantees. So that's number one thing that's happening in Sacramento. The second big thing that's happening in Sacramento is the state budget. Probably the strangest budget, let's shall we say, that I've ever dealt with. I've lost count a long time ago, but probably has been about, I think first budget I covered was in 1975, Jerry Brown's first budget as governor, and his first time around. So it's been, what, almost 50 years. So I'm sure that I'm something around 45 budgets that I've dealt with over that time. The budget in those days, by the way, I think Jerry Brown's first budget was something on the order of general fund, I think was around $7 billion. $7 billion. Gavin Newsom's general fund budget proposal is more like $175 billion. So it's grown a little bit since 1975. Now, about that great surplus he talks about, or I should say bragged about, because that's what he was doing, bragged about the surplus. Well, what is it? It depends on your definition of surplus. He threw everything in but the kitchen sink. He wanted to make it seem as big as it possibly could be so he could propose a very big expenditure program to soak up that surplus. So he said it was $75 billion surplus. And then he said, now I got $75 billion, now I'm going to add another 26 or $27 billion that the federal government's giving California. And therefore, I'm going to have a $100 billion economic recovery program. And then the legislative analysts came along and say, not so fast. The budget surplus isn't $75 billion. It's only half that. It's about $38 billion. Why the difference? Because the governor counted the kind of gross amount of revenue that will be available, projected to be available, over and above what was being spent before, essentially, the baseline budget of the state. The ledge analyst says, no, that's not the way we count surpluses. You have to put into the equation all the money that you have no control over, that has to be spent by law, and the biggest chunk being for schools. So when you put the money that's being the automatic increases in spending, then that only leaves about $38 billion for the governor and the legislature to allocate, plus the federal funds. And the governor then, the numbers are not different. It's how you interpret the numbers or how you define the numbers that are really different. But I have to add to that the caveat. The caveat is that this surplus, whatever it is, will be available only if the revenues projections for the rest of this fiscal year and the next fiscal year come true. That's a very important point, because this is not money in hand. This is money that's projected to come in, and the projected expenditures, then all of these things are projections or best guesses. And if one thing is known, I've actually writing this on this subject in my Sunday column, is that governors have been very, very inaccurate in how they forecast revenue numbers. Back in 2 years ago, Governor Newsom and his Department of Finance said that the revenues from the big taxes, income taxes, sales taxes, and corporate income taxes, for this fiscal year, for the 2021 fiscal year, would be $145 billion. And then a year ago, when COVID had hit, they downplayed that from 145 to $114 billion. The newest budget that he released last week forecast that the revenues during this fiscal year will be $175 billion. So he went from 145 to 114 to 175, which illustrates that it's very, very difficult to accurately predict revenues. Now, why is that true? It's true because 70% of the state's general fund revenues come from personal income taxes. Now, to put that in some kind of perspective, when Jerry Brown was governor, when I started covering politics in 1975, personal income taxes were the second biggest revenue source behind sales taxes. But over time, sales taxes have not grown as fast as personal income taxes by far. And now personal income taxes are 70% of the state's general fund revenues. And 1% of taxpayers, about 150,000 tax filers in a state of 40 million people, about 150,000 people, actually are 150,000 tax returns, so some of those are joint, most of them are joint returns, supply almost half of all the personal income tax revenues. The top 1% of taxpayers are paying almost half of all the personal income taxes in California. And so you have to try to really predict how they are doing, how their incomes are doing. And much of their incomes come from capital gains. And you really in a business where trying to predict the revenues of California is trying to guess what the stock market's going to do over the next 18 months. Good luck on that, right? And the reason these forecasts have changed and been so inaccurate in the past is because nobody can really predict what the stock market's going to do over the next 18 months. And that's why the surplus, whatever it is dependent on projections of revenues that are notoriously difficult to project. So there may not be 38 billion or 75 billion, or there might be more than that. Nobody truly knows. But they have to, the budget is based on a figure, a number. What is the revenue available to us? And so probably the legislature over the next few weeks will adopt the governor's revenue estimate and proceed to spend that surplus, whatever it might be, based on those revenue estimates. Now, what the governor proposes is to basically, number one, there's another factor in it, and that's the GAN limit passed by voters in 1979 and modified about a decade later, that requires that whenever revenues reach a certain point of growth, they grow faster than usual, some of that money has to go back to taxpayers. Some of it goes to schools, and some of it has to go back to taxpayers. So the governor has chosen to say, okay, I've got to rebate money back to the taxpayers. And he pegs that number, as I recall, at about $12 billion. But I'm not going to give it back to all the taxpayers. He's certainly not going to give it back to those 1%ers who supplied most of that money. He's going to give it back in the form of rebates to low and moderate income taxpayers up to about $75,000 a year. So that's a big chunk of the surplus spending. And the rest of it is going to go, along with the federal funds, go to a wide variety of program expansions. Over 400 either new programs or program expansions, mostly in the education and social service realm. Such thing, kind of a wish list of the left-wing Democratic wish list that's at the national level as well as the state level. Things that the Bernie-crat wing of the Democratic Party wants to do. Things like universal pre-kindergarten services, expanding Medi-Cal coverage to undocumented immigrants. In Gavin Newsom's pet project, changing schools into kind of one-stop shop social service centers for neighborhoods, and a whole variety of other kind of wish list programs that would be given money out of this surplus. Now, that in itself raises another issue, which nobody at the Capitol really wants to address, which is, okay, you have surplus money, whatever it might be. You're going to spend it on all these 400 things that you want to spend the money on. What happens when this cornucopia of new revenues stops? What happens when it plateaus out? When we get another recession or whatnot? What happens when the federal money dries up? How do you finance these new programs and these expanded programs at that point? And the politics is a notoriously short-term business. long-term in politics is the next election. And in this case, the next election is next November, right? So a recall election. So the emphasis of this budget basically is to grease the squeakiest wheels that are out there in California that might encourage people to vote for the recall. So he offers money to people in general, low and moderate income people in general. He offers new loans and assistance to small business. He helps puts some undocumented immigrants on the Medi-Cal rolls, does all these things to make people kind of feel good things, hitting a wide variety of potential voters. So a lot of this budget is undoubtedly aimed at just simply counteracting the recall, trying to make people have warm and fuzzy feelings about the governor because he's handing them money. And he's lubricating, essentially, he's using the budget as a political campaign to forestall the recall. Even though there's not really much danger he's going to be recalled, nevertheless, he doesn't want to take any chances. But it still leaves the issue of what happens later. What happens if he beats the recall? What happens if he is reelected to a second term next year? And these programs, these new programs and services are now there. They've been started. The appetite has been whetted. Can you then cut back on these things once they're started? No, they become de facto entitlements. And it then would raise the question of, well, should we raise taxes to keep these new programs going? Now, there is a great sentiment in the legislature for increasing taxes. Even though California is seeing record high revenues, even though California has the first, second, or third, take your pick, highest tax burden of any state, we're up around, in the neighborhood of about 12% of personal income in state and local taxes. And that puts us right up there with New York and New Jersey and all the other high taxing states. It's difficult to do a direct comparison because everything's always changing year to year. But suffice to say, we're right up there near the top in that. And to put some numbers on that, personal income in California is, even despite this recession, is up there in the neighborhood of well over $2.5 trillion a year. The tax systems of California, and there are a lot of taxes nobody even knows they're paying, believe me, because I one time tried to catalog all of them and it took up more than a sheet of paper. State and local taxes in California are something north of $300 billion a year, all told. And it works out to around 12% of personal income. And if you look at, and that's a fair way of comparing tax systems because tax systems vary so much from state to state. The best thing you can do is take the totality of state and local taxes and compare it to the totality of state and local taxes in other states. And by that comparison, California is right near or maybe at the top taxing state in the United States. So, however, notwithstanding, there are a great number of legislators who want to raise those taxes more. In fact, the California Taxpayers Association calculated that the bills introduced this year in the legislature would raise taxes by something on the order of $250 billion a year. Now, they're not all going to pass. Maybe none of them will pass. We don't know. The governor says, we don't need any more tax increases right now. Of course, he doesn't want to be a recall. He doesn't want to be out there saying we need more taxes. But nevertheless, he builds into this budget a demand factor that might be possibly only met by new taxes down the line somewhere. Either a personal income tax increase. There's a lot of talk in the Capitol about making the wealthy pay their fair share. What's the fair share? They're paying 47% of the taxes now, income taxes. Should it be 50% or 60%? I don't know. There's a lot of support in the legislature for raising corporate income taxes by changing various mechanisms. Actually, the governor's budget changes one corporate tax by adopting some of the tax changes made at the federal level that have the effect of raising some corporate taxes. Nobody talks about raising sales taxes at this point. I think there's a realization that you just can't go beyond their sales taxes in many localities right now. State and local sales taxes are over 10%. And there's kind of probably a ceiling there, a political ceiling that you probably couldn't breach. Plus the fact that sales taxes are widely viewed as regressive. That is, they're paid fall higher on low income people. So there's not a lot of sympathy for raising sales taxes at the state level. There is quite a bit of activity about raising sales taxes at the local level. As you know, these tax overrides are a constant feature on ballots every 2 years. We see a whole flock of local sales tax increases of one kind or another, as well as partial taxes and hotel and motel taxes and that sort of thing. But at any rate, that's the situation. The state has a lot of money to spend, although we don't know how much. We don't even know that will materialize. The governor wants to spend it on a pretty huge expansion of government at all levels, on homelessness, on kindergarten instruction, on health benefits, on a whole variety of things. The legislative analyst who advises the legislature on the budget say, wait a minute, we shouldn't be doing all this new spending. We don't know if the money's going to be there. You're kind of in a scattergun approach. Let's do maybe a few things well, but don't try to do 400 service increases or new services all at once. And we really should be putting more money in the rainy day fund, because the higher the budget gets, the more money you need to protect it should there be an economic downturn. But his advice will probably be ignored by the legislature, because if anything, the legislature wants to spend more money than Gavin Newsom wants to spend. So they'll sign on to everything Gavin Newsom wants and probably more. It's that kind of time. I think that a lot of this there's a certain psychological impetus for expansive government because of the change of administrations in Washington. You have a president who now wants to expand government pretty dramatically with infrastructure programs, and wants to raise taxes. And so that kind of spirit kind of filters down in California and says, well, if they're doing it in Washington, we ought to do it more too. We ought to show them how to do it. We ought to really go to town. So there's a lot of kind of psychological impetus towards expanding government services, spending more money, and down the road, perhaps raising taxes. That's the train that's running on the tracks right now. It could be derailed by something, and it's certainly, maybe you see it's a bullet train on the tracks running right now. Although it better run better than the real bullet train, which doesn't run at all. And by the way, the budget includes $4.2 billion of new spending on the bullet train out of bond funds, not out of this surplus, but out of the bond funds that the voters passed 10 years ago, whatever it was, 12, 13 years ago. So that's in the budget too, even though Gavin Newsom came very close at one point, very early in his governorship, of saying we ought to get rid of the bullet train. He got the boom lowered on him by the construction unions. And he said, oh, no, I don't mean to get rid of it. And so now they want to run. So now the train runs from basically Chowchilla to an orchard north of north of Bakersfield. That's the current project. Newsom says, no, I want to expand it up to Merced on the north so that it can someday hook into Bay Area train service and expand it to Bakersfield on the south. So the Chowchilla Choo-Choo is actually growing under Gavin Newsom rather than being abandoned, which he originally said he probably wanted to do. So that's the nature of government, I guess. I'm going to stop right there and respond to whatever questions I can.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I'm starting to get questions. Please use the chat function. And let me know that you have something. I have already seen one hand raised, and I will get to that in just a minute. I will let some people talk, but I'm going to try to monitor the questions. So if we have duplicates, I can pull them together. But I think I'd be remiss if I didn't ask one question about, this magic surplus that showed up this year. Do you think it had to do with coronavirus, or what factors gave us this alleged bucket of money?
Well, the biggest factor is simply this, that the higher income people who supply the bulk of taxes in California were not, for the most part, adversely affected by the pandemic. People worked from home, their incomes continued, and their investments in the stock market did extremely well. The market's been on a tear for the last, this year anyway, beyond this year. And all of those factors have had the effect of raising taxable incomes, even though we had hundreds of thousands of people out of work, even though our unemployment rate hit 16% at one point, and at 8.3%, according to the new data that just came out today, is still the second highest in the country, behind Hawaii's 8.5%. Despite all those macroeconomic factors, the people who actually pay most of the taxes have not suffered, and in fact have prospered. And that's why we're getting this this kind of boom in tax revenues that's projected to continue on in subsequent years. Whether that's accurate or not is another question.
Yeah. Okay, we have one question that's come in, and then I'll follow it with a comment from another one. Do we have, let me rephrase there. Don't we have another budget problem arising from the state's use of cash-based accounting versus accrual? I have seen estimates that the state incurs obligations each year of $10 to $15 billion annually for pension and OPEB costs that are put on a credit card with interest instead of incurring the true cost each year. We thus see these OPEB and pension obligations growing each year, a bill that will compound with interest each year and be a growing problem for our kids and grandkids. Your thoughts?
I understand the question, and I've seen over the years the states shift from cash to accrual, back to cash, back to accrual, whatever happens to get them through that year, the easiest. But the questioner is correct, is that you have a continuing obligations for pensions and benefits. Now, let's put that in context. Number one is the state government does not have a pension problem particularly. The reason for that is that the state gives most of its money away to other people, gives it away to the schools, gives it away to the counties for health and welfare programs, gives it away to the state and university and college system. It doesn't spend much of its budget itself on its own operations with its own employees. So it has a manageable budget pension situation. In fact, some of the surplus the governor wants to spend on spending down the state's pending pension obligations. The problem with the pension system is not the state's problem, it's the problem of local governments, particularly cities. They are the ones with a big pension problem. CalPERS trust fund is a pooled account of the state, which is about half of it, and local governments, which are about the other half. But each employer has its own account and its own set of actuarial studies, its own thing. So you have hundreds of separate pension plans that are managed by one entity and pooled assets. That said, overall, CalPERS has a very difficult unfunded liability issue that's growing every year. And it's by its own numbers, CalPERS is about 70% funded. But that number assumes an annual earnings average of about 7% on its investments, and it hasn't been doing that. It hasn't been making the 7%. So in truth, the unfunded liability is higher than 30%. It's probably 40% at least. That's for the system as a whole. But again, the system as a whole is amalgam of a whole bunch of hundreds of systems that are kind of merged together for management purposes. And the state's part of that is not terribly bad. And in fact, they've kept up with it fairly well relative to the local government situation, because the state does not have a big payroll in relationship to its total budget, whereas cities particularly have huge payrolls in relationship to their budgets. So the answer is yes, there is an accruing problem with pensions, but it's not a problem for the state budget. It's a problem for the state as a whole, but not necessarily a problem for the state budget. The state's part of that problem is relatively manageable. It's not a big burden. I think the state's spending about $6 billion a year on pensions, something like that. It's not a huge number in relationship to the budget. It's a manageable problem, but the problem is bigger than that, and it really involves local governments more than it does the state.
Okay.
I hope it makes some sort of sense to people. It's a difficult thing to get your head around, but CalPERS is not the state. CalPERS is an entity unto itself, of which the state is only one small part, relatively small part.
Okay, for our next question, I'm going to recognize our executive team member, Bill Baker. Bill, ask your question.
Thank you, Sue. And Dan, it's great to see you again
Nice to see you, Bill.
after many years. When I was there, we were putting 500 million of the general fund into STRS, the State Teachers Retirement System. And I wondered if the Republicans are suggesting we pay down debt, pay down the unfunded liability of both PERS and STRS, or are they just sitting there watching this spending free go by?
They and others have suggested that it would be more prudent, rather than financing a whole bunch of new services, to pay down debt. The state does not have a big debt, but nevertheless, they and the governor proposes to pay down some of that debt. CalSTRS is a different situation. As you probably know, it had a very large unfunded liability, and a few years ago, under Jerry Brown, they adopted a program to supposedly eliminate that unfunded liability over time, mostly by raising the state putting in more money, the teachers putting in more money, but mostly the districts putting in more money, rising to as much as 19% of payroll over time. Now, what's happened in the last few years is the state has been kicking money into CalSTRS directly to relieve some of the burden on the school districts, which of course get most of their money from the state to begin with. So, it's kind of one hand and the other hand. But that has, and the governor proposes, I don't think his new budget proposes any new, I'd have to go back and look, any new donations to CalSTRS, but the budget does raise school spending by a lot of money. I mean, a big wad of money, which then helps them pay their increasing share of CalSTRS's demands. And so indirectly, the state is paying down CalSTRS by giving the school districts more money so they can pay down CalPERS. As you know, these things are not simple. It's a lot of rob Peter to pay Paul, and money movement. Money is fungible, and it gets moved around in ways that sometimes are not apparent. But essentially, the state is paying down CalSTRS debt by giving the school districts more money so they can pay down CalSTRS debt.
Thanks, Dan. We have a question that says, what effect have people moving out of state had on the California economy or the budget?
Nobody knows. We know what we know, and we don't know what we don't know. We know that California loses more people to other states than it gains, and has been doing so for a number of years. In fact, the number one destination of ex-Californians is not surprisingly Texas. But who's moving and who's staying? The Public Policy Institute of California did a report on that recently and concluded that for the most part, the people who are moving out of California are lower income people who just can't afford to live here anymore. And for the most part, the people who are moving to California are more educated and higher income people. But what you don't know is what you don't know. The real $64 jillion question is this: how many of those 1%ers who are paying all those high taxes are leaving California? And there are a lot of anecdotal cases, most spectacularly Elon Musk, And I have people in my circle of acquaintances and people, other people, well, he moved to Nevada because they have no income tax, all this stuff. And there's actually a colony of California expatriates up at Incline Village in Nevada who've made their ski lodges their primary residences, so they don't have to pay income taxes to California anymore. But is it a substantial exodus? Not that anybody can prove. All we have is anecdotal stuff. Now, here's the question. California has the highest marginal income tax rates of any state by far, 13 and whatever it is, 13.3% or so. A few years ago, labor unions put a measure on the ballot to make those higher rates that Jerry Brown first put on as temporary rates, to make those more or less permanent, at least extend out to 2030. So suddenly something that was going to be very temporary became at least semi-permanent, number one. Number two, Congress and Donald Trump come along and say, you can only deduct $10,000 of your state and local taxes on your tax federal returns. So that means that those high income people who could have sloughed off a lot of their state income tax bills by deducting them on their federal income taxes can't do that any longer. In other words, the taxes really hurt. You have to really pay the taxes. You can't wish them off on the federal government. And finally, the Biden administration is proposing increases in the federal tax rate. So if those go through, the Californians at the highest income tax brackets would be paying a combined state and local income tax rate on the margin of approaching 55%. So the question is, a question without an answer is, if all of these things persist, if you can't deduct your taxes, if the federal taxes are raised and the state taxes are permanent, what number of people might be encouraged, therefore, to move their residences to Nevada or Texas or some other place that doesn't have an income tax, or some other state that has a low income tax, and kind of slip out of California's grasp, as it were. So we know it's happening anecdotally. We don't know whether it's such a movement of people that it will actually affect the income stream of the state government. So far, evidently it hasn't, because they have this big surge of revenues. But you don't know what you don't know. And you don't know what the future will bring, and you don't know, because if you're only talking about 150,000 taxpayers, it wouldn't take many of them moving, following Elon Musk to someplace else, to have that effect. But so far, there's no evidence that there's a big exodus. But if you take all of these conditions that might encourage somebody to move, and if they all come to pass, particularly the federal tax increase, and particularly the continuing the limit on deductions of state and local taxes, then it might happen to some noticeable extent in the years ahead. I hope that makes sense to people. It's a complicated equation, but and it raises questions that nobody yet can answer.
Okay. I have a question. How do you see redistricting playing out? California loses one seat, which isn't a lot, but will the impact be greater in the northern or southern part of the state?
The impact will be in the southern part of the state, and particularly in Los Angeles County. Los Angeles County has a quarter of the state's population, and it's been growing basically more slowly than just about anywhere else, at least any of the major population centers. So in the shuffle of congressional seats and losing one congressional seat, it will probably affect Los Angeles, and probably also in the reshuffling of legislative seats the same way. Even though we're not losing any seats, there's going to be a reshuffle. It's a zero-sum game. And probably we'll see a marginal shift of legislative and congressional clout, as it were, from Los Angeles out to the Inland Empire. And that will be the major effect of probably redistricting.
And I have a question. What's the latest on the $10 billion Employment Development Department COVID fraud payment scandal? And why aren't we hearing more about it?
We aren't hearing more about it, other than occasional news items about somebody being arrested for perpetuating the scandal. There's no appetite in Sacramento for digging deeply into that scandal because it would have to be Democrats who authorized the investigation, and it's Democrats who would be embarrassed by it. Particularly Julie Su, who was the head of the workforce agency and is now tapped by President Biden to become the number 2 person, I think it is, in the Department of Labor. The Republicans have tried to raise that issue with her in terms of confirmation. But I think the attitude in Sacramento is, well, it's just too bad it happened. That's about as far as it goes. I think it's part of obviously a larger problem with the Employment Development Department.
Yeah.
Which continues, which has not been cleaned up. There still has a huge backlog of cases that they have not been able to clean up. If anything, the problem has gotten worse. Even though the employment picture has increased in California, the problem has gotten worse. And I might add one other kind of thing that nobody's talking very much about. The state unemployment insurance fund, the fund that pays state unemployment benefits as opposed to the federal unemployment benefits. That fund ran out of money very quickly last year. Since then, the state has been paying out state benefits by borrowing money from the federal government. In the last recession, in the what we call the Great Recession, the state ran up about a $10 billion debt to pay unemployment insurance. And as a result, the federal government, since the state didn't repay its debt, it has to be repaid with interest. The federal government stepped in and raised the taxes on employers in California to pay off that $10 billion debt, which was just paid off very recently. The current debt stands at $21 billion from this recession and is expected to hit $23 billion by the end of the year. And once again, if the state does not pay that debt itself, the federal government will, unless there's something in Congress to forgive the debt, which is possible, then the state will have to be, the federal feds will be repaid by increasing payroll taxes on California employers for as many years as it takes to pay off that debt with interest. And it points up an underlying problem, another underlying problem with EDD that's never been resolved, which is over time, the unemployment insurance benefits have been increased without increasing the amount of money to pay for them. It's kind of like the pension debt in a way. Benefits go up, but we don't pay for them. We wish them off on the future. This is exactly what's happened with unemployment insurance, very much like pensions. The benefits were increased. The taxes were not increased because the business community said, no, we won't sanction a tax increase. Labor wanted the benefit increase. They got the labor back during the Gray Davis era. And the money was never set aside to pay for it. So the unemployment insurance fund never really became healthy. And it got clobbered in the last recession, and it's gotten clobbered again. And employers will wind up paying a huge penalty for that. It would have been much smarter for them to have paid up front, but nobody had the political guts to do that. But it's one of those other problems that California, that's a big number. $23 billion is not a small amount of money. And it's going to be something that's going to weigh on employers in California. It's essentially a hidden tax, as it were, that's going to come and hit employers in California. Just as they're trying to struggle out of recession, they're going to get hit with this tax again.
Dan, is the wealth tax still under consideration?
The wealth tax is dead for the time being. The governor has said, no way, Ray. He doesn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. He doesn't want any major tax increases. As long as this recall's out there on the horizon. And it'd be a hard sell given the fact the state is kind of wallowing in money right now. It would be a hard sell to raise any kind of taxes. It's out there. It's one of those things on the wish list of the Democratic left. They want a wealth tax at the federal level. They want a wealth tax at the state level. They want income taxes in both areas. But at the moment, at least, it's not happening.
I have time for one last question here, and it's come in. We are living again under drought conditions. A few years ago, we passed a major water bond that was supposed to finance projects to ease future droughts. we're not reading about any of those projects. What happened to them?
The money's still there. The projects are still in the pipeline. One of the things about water projects is that it takes years and years and years to get through all the engineering, the environmental studies, everything else you've got to do to actually do the work. And so having a bond issue does not generate immediate payoffs. And this is true of this one as well. And I'll give you an example. A new reservoir called the Sites Reservoir up in Colusa County, pretty close to where Jerry Brown's retirement ranch is, by the way, has been on the planning stages for over a half a century. And it's kind of getting some momentum these days after a half a century. But even if it was proved tomorrow, it probably wouldn't be online for 10 more years. So these things move at glacial paces. Glacial. I mean, tiny increments of movement on water. So one should not be surprised that we have not seen any benefits from this bond issue, visible benefits from this bond issue yet.
Oy vey. Thank you, Dan. We're about at the end of our time. Everybody, you can give a muted applause here. We want to thank you so much for spending this time with us, and you've given us a lot of great information and insight, and we appreciate it greatly. And this will be on our YouTube channel for those who want to review it and who would like to share it with friends. And until we all meet again, I would like everybody to say, please consider joining Contra Costa Taxpayers Association. Feel free to sign up for Dan Walter's column. You will not be disappointed with it. And until next time, I want to say be safe, be happy, and be well informed. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Bye-bye.